Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us to talk about climate resilience this morning. This webinar is being recorded and everybody who's registered will be sent a copy, will be sent a link. You'll also be able to post questions in the chat bar as we go through. We're going to save a bit of time at the end to answer a few questions, but all questions will be answered. We'll respond and send through a CSV file with our answers to all of your questions, so please don't hold back. So next slide, please. I'm Carol Somper, Director of Sustainability at JRP Solutions, and our two other presenters this morning are Connie Heathfield, consultant in net zero and sustainability, and the JRP associate Ben Sanson, who's a geohydrologist with an awful lot of experience in all things to do with climate resilience in the UK and internationally. So we've got a very good specialist on the webinar this morning. Next slide, please. This is what we're going to do. Just introduce you very briefly to JRP for those of you who are new to us. We'll talk about why climate resilience matters and what impacts do we need to consider. We're going to look at a whole series of impacts around your site, supply routes, suppliers and customers. And then we've got a sort of recap on what your next steps might be to progress your own approach to being a climate resilient organisation. Next slide, please. So JRP are an independent energy management and net zero consultancy. We've got 6 overlapping service lines shown out there on the right hand side. The company's been going since 1999 and we are technology agnostic. We're able to provide independent advice on a whole range of issues, and we can take you through from scoping out where you need to start around net zero and energy management through to project solutions at the other end. We are a virtual organisation. We're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030. It's primarily around scope 3, and our process is very much aligned to ISO 14068 carbon neutrality or net zero in all scopes, and that's the process that we apply for our clients. We're also a B Corp. Next slide, please. So why does climate resilience matter? This has been going up the policy agenda for quite some time now, and it is acknowledged that climate change is probably the biggest single threat to humanity, to our way of life. It is already causing widespread and severe consequences for people across the globe. It's affecting ecosystems, and all of that impacts on the global economy. Instead of focusing just on the money, we need to look beyond that, and I think that's definitely happening now. Not least because those who are affected by climate change are those who are disproportionately at most risk. They're the most vulnerable. And we've seen in recent years how extreme weather events are starting to impact on food production, certainly on water security. It's affecting our infrastructure. One or two of you may have picked up that the Panama Canal, shipping going through the Panama Canal, is being affected through low water levels. So everything is interconnected, and these compounding impacts are affecting our ability to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but also they're affecting our ability to function on a day-to-day basis. It's only going to get worse unless we do something. So we're going to talk today about what climate resilience means in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. Ben and I put this scary diagram together about 8 years ago, and it's even more important now that if you look down at the bottom right corner, climate-related extreme weather events, droughts, heat waves, flooding, snowfall, could be hail, they have an impact on infrastructure failure. Extreme heat has caused rail lines into London mainline stations to buckle over the last 10 years, and it affects people getting into work. So commerce is affected by climate change. We know that. It ends up causing financial losses. It's affecting your bottom line. It's affecting transport and logistics. Everything's connected. And you may have seen some commentators on this have put climate change as the first domino to go. Extreme weather events are causing failures in markets, leading to geopolitical upsets and failures, social unrest. It's all connected. So if we go into the next slide. And this is because absolutely everything we depend on comes from the Earth. We don't have, we only have planet A, there is no planet B. So we are completely reliant on extractive industries, which are very energy intensive, minerals, oil, gas, coal. They're energy intensive and causing, probably, if you go back down supply chains, 80% of global emissions are caused by roughly about 20 to 25 companies in those extractive industries, because we rely on those energy systems. So moving away into renewable energy systems is absolutely imperative. Using energy more efficiently is absolutely imperative. But also we rely on natural systems to produce food. That's on land and it's in the sea. So everything is connected. Even if you're working in the tertiary sector in banking or insurance, actually the insurance sector is really on top of this and increasingly so. But if you're a service industry, everything that you're using to operate on a day-to-day basis is still coming from our primary industries. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we're aiming for business continuity. So resilience is two things: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about reducing the causes of emissions in the first place. So it's about moving to more energy efficient systems. It's switching away from fossil fuels to renewable energy in every aspect of our economy. It's how we move things. It's sustainable transport. It's how we live. It's sustainable places. I think that's what's meant by complete community, so that we are looking at making things more equitable, more efficient for everybody. It's not just about, because if you look at our economy at the moment, it's very skewed. There's a very small proportion of the global population, probably 10 to 15%, who own about 80% of the wealth, which is really, really not equitable at all. And that's another reason why we have these great disparities causing these problems. Access to clean water is a good one. So that's mitigation on the one hand. Can we do things better? Adaptation is learning how to live with the changes that we're already seeing. How can we increase flood protection and de-risk areas from flooding? How can we make sure that our infrastructure is being adapted so that we're less at risk of overheating? If you think back maybe 5–10 years, I think it was a cheese grater building in the City of London. Because of cost cutting inefficiencies in the build, it reduced some of the shading impacts at the top of the building, which meant that cars on the road, parked cars, were starting to heat up, and bits of them were melting in the heat. So it's thinking about the unintended consequences of actions. We've got to be much more joined up about how we do things, and we've got to be much more responsive to how we try and avoid disasters happening in the first place, but how we respond to them really quickly. So those two questions are really important. What is your company, your organization working on now to increase your resilience in terms of what are you doing to mitigate and what are you doing to adapt? And that's at your site level and with your suppliers. So looking at the risks and de-risking your operations should identify opportunities. You can flip that over into opportunities for improving your resilience in a way that makes you more profitable, more secure in the long term, and ultimately a better business. So there are big gains here. Next slide, please. This is already flipping over into regulation. The International Sustainability Standards Board has set a global baseline for ESG metrics, environmental, social and governance, good practice metrics. That's voluntary, but it's starting to come through in different ways. And if we take the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and the metrics that underpin that, that's already in the regulations. It started this year for reporting next year. And there are relevant standards, KPIs for measuring adaptation and mitigation metrics. And that's because it's taken the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure around being more resilient in the face of climate change for investment purposes into those regulations. It's also coming into UK regulations in the Transport Transition Plan Task Force. We have our own version of that regulation now on the statute books, and the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure is coming. That's already established, it's voluntary, but that is also almost certainly going to come into regulatory frameworks within the next 12 to 18 months. So you can't ignore it, so why not get ahead of the curve? Next slide, please. So we've identified 4 main areas of impact that Connie and Ben particularly are going to be talking about next, starting off with your sites, what's happening on your site, around your sites, supply routes into and out of your sites, and extending that out further, what's going on in your supply chain, what are your suppliers doing, and then how is all that coming back to customers? How is that meeting customer needs or providing continuity of supply to meet customer needs? So next slide, please. And I'm now handing over to Ben, who's going to take you through what you can do around supply, site and supply routes. Ben.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, so next slide, please. What I'm going to talk you through are 2 main categories of environmental risk, and I'm talking about natural environment risk associated with a site you may own, or for prospective sites if you're looking at increasing the portfolio of sites you have for your business. So the first group of natural environment risks are actually associated with climate change. So those are the ones where climate change has a direct impact on the natural environment around you. And the second grouping of natural environmental risks are actually around the site setting. So where is your site located, or your portfolio of sites? So those could be for the terrestrial environment, and they could also be to the aquatic environment. So you may have premises which are close to open water, as well as sites that may be located adjacent to or within a protected area. Next slide. So the first grouping I'll touch on is the climate change risk areas. So the first one, which everybody knows about, is flood risk. Now, flooding can occur in 3 principal ways. You've got river flooding, you've got coastal flooding, but also you have the third one, which is groundwater flooding. And in the UK at the moment, because of the extremely wet winter that we've been having, there are some parts of the country which are now beginning to experience groundwater flooding, where groundwater levels are actually reaching the surface. So you'll see surface water ponding in fields and in perhaps some urban areas. And it's actually because of the upward pressure of groundwater, because the water table has reached the surface. So those kind of impacts are affected by climate change directly because they're linked to how our climate is changing over time. We might be experiencing more frequent short-term high intensity rainfall events. We might be also experiencing longer periods of rainfall where it may not be quite so intense, but we go well beyond the annual average, and over time we get flooding impacts occurring. Coastal erosion is another one where we get changes in sea level over time. And in the UK, as we know, we have several coastal environments which are very vulnerable to erosion and risk, most notably the Norfolk coast. And And when you're looking at your site and you're looking at what you would like to do with it and what you're currently doing with it, it's always useful to understand, well, how close are we to an impact area? Are we within it or adjacent to it? And could it actually impact our business? Now, the third one, which links into climate change risks, is actually of subsidence. And that links directly back into flooding risk, where we have periods of time where we have perhaps unusually wet weather in areas of the country where we might have a high clay content in the soils. Those soils will swell up, and the swelling will actually cause some heaving, and it will change potentially the integrity of the foundation. Likewise, if we have longer than expected durations of really high temperatures, we have a long hot summer, then obviously the ground's going to dry out a significant amount. And if you've got a high clay content in the soils, those soils will shrink. And again, those could cause an impact on the fabric of the building. And then the final area for climate change impacts is water scarcity. If we don't have enough rainfall, recharging the rivers and the groundwater sources that the water companies use for our water supply, both industrial and potable supply, then clearly that could have an impact not only on us as residents, but it could have impacts on the processes that we use in our business. So those are the four main groupings for climate change risk. The other grouping I've included are looking at other general environment risks around your site. So they comprise habitats. So as I said earlier, you may have a site that it's located within or adjacent to a protected area from an ecological perspective. Now, the reason that might be of interest for you is that if you're looking at climate change related risks, there are a lot of data sets that you can use to actually understand other environmental risks around your site. And it's actually more efficient to actually gather that data in one go to understand your entire site risk than it is to look at things in a piecemeal fashion. The second environment risk is actually more related to previous land use. So that's your historic land and contamination that derives from historic industrial land uses. So it might be that your site's within an urban area close to a river. So you might have an actual environment risk from flooding due to changes in climate change. Or you might actually have historic contamination on the site, which may or may not still prove a risk to surface water receptors, in which case you need to understand what those risks are. The third environment risk is actually statutory designations. So we've talked about habitats around you that are sensitive. Many of those will obviously be protected. So are you in an area of outstanding natural beauty? Are you within or close to a SSSI site or other similar designated area? And again, that could have an impact on what you would want to do with the site for perhaps development or what risks you need to look at if you're looking at acquiring a site. And then the final one is water quality. So that links back in with the processes that you use on your site and what you're doing with any wastewater, whether you're cleaning it on site before discharge, or if you have an agreement with a water utility for doing some primary treatment and then they do the final polishing. Equally, it could be down to poor water quality from historic land use. So again, it's understanding whether or not your site or sites close to you are having an impact on the local water supply, because that could have an impact on your business. Next slide, please. So where do you get this information from? Well, there are a number of commercial data providers in the UK who provide information packs based upon a national grid reference centering on a site. And they will provide you with a whole raft of different environmental pieces of information which you can look at. You can also find free environmental information on the internet. So I've just highlighted 3 sources here. We work very closely with Groundshore, who supply environmental data for land transaction purposes. That data comes from a wide variety of UK national government organisations, such as the Environment Agency, the British Coal Authority, Natural England. And they've actually produced a product called Groundshore IO, which has basically been put together to replace a former Environment Agency website that used to be called What's in My Backyard. You can go onto groundshot.io, you can put in your postcode, and you can put in a number of layers of environment data to get a general feel for what kind of risks could be associated with your site. Other data sources you can go direct to are the UK government's DEFRA website called Magic, and that holds a complementary source of data there. And then you can go onto the UK government website and look at environment data, where you can get raw data sets from that. Now, what I would say is you can get the information, but obviously you need to make sure that you've got people working with you or for you who understand what that information means for you and your business. Next slide, please. So I've just shown a quick example of what you could do with some of this environmental data, and this all comes from groundshot.io. I've put in a dummy site. The base map shows that it's adjacent to some old medieval salt workings. Gives you an indication it might be in a floodplain. Next slide. What I've overlain here is the risk of flooding information. And as you can see, this site that's on a new development area is in a location which has a potential for low to medium risks from flooding from rivers and from the sea. Next slide. Okay, we can overlay then other information which actually shows us areas which are protected from flooding and have a reduced risk of flooding. And as you can see, this particular site, even though it's in a flood risk area, is actually within a zone that has some protection from flood defences. It's actually quite close to a river, which is only a few hundred metres away from a coastal outflow. So it's actually the flood defences are protecting you from both river flooding and from coastal flooding through changing in tides. Next slide. And again, the final slide I've got here for this zoom in on the site just shows you recorded floods. So this gives you an indication of, well, has flooding actually been seen there in the past? And there's a site here just to the west, a residential area which has recorded flooding. Next slide. And finally, we can see that you can zoom out and there are other data sets. And this one just shows you where you've got some public water supply boreholes located nearby. The site's not within those areas, so there shouldn't be an impact from your site process on those. And also there's a hatched area with a black line around it. Those actually show areas of previous historic contamination and artificial ground. Final slide, please, for me. So we've looked and talked a lot about environmental risks and data and where you can get them from. So when you're looking at your business nationally and where you get your goods from and how you transport your goods to clients, using this environmental data, you can assess whether there are risks of flooding or from subsidence issues, or whether you've got water supply issues. And you can see whether there are risks for your transport networks for all site users. You can also look at the route of your main infrastructure links and go, are there risks to those? From an international basis, actually, you can zoom out, and data sets are a little bit more trickier to come by, but you do need to think about what goes beyond my initial in-country supply chain. If I need to get goods to a port, okay, I can understand my in-country risks there using data we can get, but also you need to think about, well, if I'm bringing raw materials in for my business, there could be a whole load of other international risks that you need to consider, such as climate change impacts on raw materials, looking at agricultural crop failures, maybe on the other side of the planet. You could be looking at disruption on shipping routes from increased risk of hurricane and cyclones. And you've also got the political stability added on that. Well, we know there are very unstable areas of the world now which are impacting on our shipping routes at the minute. And finally, as Carol's also mentioned, when you're looking at climate change risks on both the ocean and also on rivers, that has an impact on your supply chain. The River Danube has had massive problems in recent years from drought, where large inland waterway cargo ships haven't been able to actually navigate that river as often as they would like. And finally, we've obviously talked about international shipping routes, such as the Panama Canal, where that's having problems at the minute with a lack of rainwater. So I'll now hand over to Connie, and she's going to talk to you about supply chain resilience.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide, please. So all of the factors that Ben and Carol have been talking about, as mentioned, affect the global supply chain, which can cause supply chain disruptions and therefore impact the longevity of businesses. So we need to think about how we mitigate that. And the way to do that is thinking about sustainable supply chain management. And as an overview, that might include risk assessment and planning, including scenario simulation, both stakeholder and supplier engagement and communication, continuous monitoring and evaluation of your supply chain, and potentially diversification of suppliers. It can be quite a daunting thing from experience working with some of our clients. So what I want to do is give an introduction of where to start and the key themes to think about when approaching sustainable supply chain management. So next slide, please. The first step is to obtain a leadership commitment within your organisation. That's important so that you can set goals, obtain resource, and also influence procedures. And to do so, it's important to put forward a business case that highlights the cost of inaction to the business, and links to strategic objectives, and also present a plan of how you intend to approach engaging with suppliers. Next slide, please. So the plan should map out how you intend to engage with suppliers, as I mentioned. The goal of supplier engagement is to understand where your supplier's starting point is, where the risks and opportunities are within your supply chain, so that you can prioritise who are the key suppliers having an impact, where is the key risk that you need to address. And once you have that list of priority suppliers, opening a dialogue with them about why action is important and figuring out where you can support them to mitigate some of that risk. And this model on the left kind of summarises that. So the inner ring is building the context, where are the impacts and vulnerabilities, and where is there opportunity. The darker ring is putting in place some of the actions that you've identified. And then upon success with those actions with your key suppliers, they can become case studies for working with the wider supply chain. So you can roll on the successes across your supply chain. Next slide, please. So a key thing to think about is when first approaching your suppliers is that you've engaged with the right person. Again, from experience, it's often the case that the first point of contact isn't necessarily aware of what the organisation is doing. So you might not get that much from them. It's often the case with small organisations that it's someone in management that is taking on the responsibility of sustainability and climate risk. So make sure you ask the question, who's the right person to talk to, who's going to be aware of what's going on. And also, if you're not getting that engagement back, move higher up the organisation. In terms of the type of questions to ask on initial engagement, think about how much they understand about their climate resilience and risk. Where are the knowledge gaps? What have they done already and what are they intending to do? What are the risks within sourcing of materials for that supplier? Could they do sourcing elsewhere? And also, where are there opportunities for collaboration or support with that supplier? Next slide, please. So upon gaining that context and finding who are the key suppliers with the largest impact to address, the next step is designing an action plan for collaborating with that supplier. And collaboration can be as simple as knowledge sharing and data gathering, but it can also be a bit more rigorous, such as carbon insetting. And very briefly, what carbon insetting is an organisation investing in sustainable practices within a supplier organisation in order to reduce their own Scope 3 impacts and risks. It strengthens the relationship with the client and also supports the shared industry. It's essentially a form of carbon offsetting, but directly with that supplier organisation. Next slide, please. So to pull all these things together, I just wanted to look at a good practice approach to sustainable supply chain management. And IKEA has quite a rigorous approach, which they're able to do being a large organisation with a lot of influence, but the key themes sort of apply across other organisations. So briefly, what they've introduced is a supplier code of conduct, which they expect suppliers to adhere to. They audit and assess their suppliers. They engage in training and capacity building, collaborative initiatives and development programs with their suppliers. And essentially the goal is creating long-term partnerships with their key suppliers. And an example of this is with the Better Cotton Initiative, who are they've essentially created a certification and support network for sustainable cotton farming. And what IKEA have done is they source a lot of their cotton through BCI certified farms. They fund BCI initiatives for supporting cotton farmers and training cotton farmers. And they work with BCI to raise awareness about the importance of consumers purchasing sustainable cotton. So what this approach does is it supports the cotton industry and also compounds IKEA's ability to source sustainable cotton long term. And there's lots of resources that I'm happy to share that kind of dive into this a little bit more detail, as well as some more resources about carbon insetting and some of the other things that I've mentioned. So please let me know and I'd be happy to share those. But as I say, very much a whistle-stop tool. So I'm going to pass back to Carol, who's going to talk about meeting customer needs long term.
Thanks, Connie. Thanks, Ben. So we've covered quite a lot of detail there. Now we're going to look at customers. Next slide, please. What do your customers need to know about how you're making big efforts to make sure that you can continue to meet their needs? So it's good if you can share, as part of your marketing story, what you're doing about contingency planning and how you're making sure that you've got business continuity measures in place. Marketing is a great tool to be able to do this well. And when Connie was talking about making sure that you're talking to the right people in an organisation, it's really important to try and bring in your supplier and partner businesses, their marketing teams too, so that you're all working together on this, because it's about building confidence, not just with your immediate clients and consumers, but also, as we know now, with suppliers and with investors. And it may mean that you need to change how you do things to continue to meet supplier needs. The picture in the top there is the top of the tram depot in Basel, and the city of Basel have collaborated on an initiative across the whole area to create green roofs where possible. This counteracts the urban heat island effect, and it's great for customers in places like the tram depot because it's creating a much more comfortable microclimate. It's keeping it warmer in the winter, and it's also helping to keep it cooler in the summer. So there are things that you can do on an individual basis or as part of a collaborative effort within your supply chain or within the location where you're based to do these things to make it work for everyone. There's a little plug there for nearshoring. Traditionally, if you go back a few decades, we've offshored a lot of manufacturing to other parts of the globe. We're now bringing a lot of that back home because it reduces supply chain risks from a climate resilience perspective, as well as having other benefits. You can be much fleeter of foot, much faster to respond to changes in markets if you've got your immediate suppliers closer to hand. So that's something to think about too. And another really good example of collaboration is the fair trade building resilience in a changing world, looking at how their growers are able to continue to produce crops and overcome some of the issues of climate impacts in terms of drought, water scarcity, wildfires. It is really about collaboration. Next slide, please. So what do your stakeholders need to know? Not just your investors, but also other business partners, and it could also be the communities where you're based. It's important, again, to make sure that you are communicating your business continuity planning, how you're dealing with risk. that you disclose and communicate those things in a really transparent way. You identify what mitigation measures are being taken, and you're able to do that in a quantitative way that avoids greenwashing, that you're being really upfront about it, and also about being honest about things that you haven't quite resolved yet, but you are working on. And the adaptation measures you're putting in place to make sure that your sites can continue to operate using information in the way that Ben's described earlier. If you don't disclose, you're going to risk your reputation. You may ultimately be at risk of negligence and legal action against you. So it's about being upfront and open. Don't hide your head in the sand. And again, there's a good case study here with Nestlé, the work that they're doing in producing bottled water in the UK. They've gone for the Alliance for Water Stewardship certification, and they've achieved platinum because they're working with landowners and other businesses in the catchments that they're drawing their product from, their spring water from, and making sure that the issues are being addressed collectively, that people are working together, and that local communities are also involved. They're drawing their employees from the local community. It's important that, again, that your local your employees can get to work, that your employees will continue to have a job, that you're able to continue producing your main product. So do have a look at that one. Next slide, please. And this works well for climate action, SDG number 13, working with your suppliers, working with industry bodies within your sector and across sectors. There are big cross-sectoral links that need to be maintained. Nobody works in a vacuum. If you think back to the scary diagram, and it's really about sharing good practice and learning. There are lots of good practice and learning examples out there, and there's one there about logistics, resilient strategies for future logistics. So do have a look at that one from the TGL. Next slide, please. So we're just going to have a quick recap on the ideas that give you for what your next steps might be. Create your team, make sure that that team is coming from across the business. You need to have a board sponsor, you need to have your sales and marketing people, you may need your HR people to look at changes in formal job roles and responsibilities to make sure that it's being embedded in how you do things day to day. Start small. You may start with just a few priority facilities or locations and map out what the issues are, the risks, the opportunities, and again, take employee risks and welfare into account. Prioritize those risks, scope out and identify what data you need, and then start qualifying those opportunities. What are cost neutral that you can put into place really quickly? Which are the measures that are going to need investment over time, and over what time frame? How are you going to embed that into your business strategy? And then last slide. Once those risks and opportunities are fully understood for the pilot sites for particular products, it's understood from top to bottom within your business, you can start taking comprehensive action and integrating those actions into your existing business systems. Mitigation and adaptation, they've got to be worked on together. They've got to go into your risk management processes, your emergency planning processes, and your day-to-day operational risks and opportunities. We've talked about looking at both local and global. Every tier of your supply chain is ultimately going to be important to look at, right down to the raw materials that you're dependent on. And ultimately, all of this, whilst it might seem a lot of work, and you've got to reorganize how you're doing things to make sure that you're putting the resources in place, as Connie outlined, it is going to be really good for business. It's a really good investment to make, and be ready for more regulation. It is coming, and I hopefully everybody on the call, the webinar today can understand that that's for very good reason. So we've got a couple of minutes, I think, left to answer a few questions. Let's see what we've got in the question bar. How do we ensure that financial cost of climate mitigation measures are not too big for client organisations? There are lots of trade bodies looking at this, and the example that we ended with, the logistics sector, there's an international logistics platform looking at this. So I would go back to your trade bodies as well and see where you can, if you're not able to do something yourself because of there's a lack of investment, it's also worth talking to your bank. Banks are looking at this very seriously too, and where you, as Connie was talking about insetting, where you could talk to some of your bigger clients or some of your suppliers to see where there's something that can be done collectively. Extractive industries. These seem not to follow the current trends in climate change as their actions as, yeah. There are regulations coming globally. And actually, if you look at the Californian regulation that came into force last year, all businesses based in California and operating out of California are required to report on their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions within a broader context. The TCFD good practice standards are now in regulations in, I think, about 50 countries, not just UK and EU states, but also coming into the Far East. If I give one of these questions to somebody else, Ben, do you want to take that one from Gilbert? Suppliers in other countries not concerned with climate change.
I would say from my experience, it very much depends on their client base and where their client comes from. So if you have an international business that might be an area, let's say in Asia, where there is where it's an agricultural product, they might find that actually, you know, sort of 40–50% of their crop is actually exported. And what we tend to find is a lot of the international buyers are actually working in partnership with those suppliers to actually try and de-risk climate change impacts on their ultimate supplier operation. So it's one of these things. You have in-country national government obligations on those local businesses, but you also have the supplier side. So it's definitely, at the moment, we're working at things from both angles to try and get as good an outcome as we can.
I think we've got time for. No, I think we've covered those things. What happens if you do carbon insetting with a supplier and then they raise their rates in a few years and you have to change supplier? Carbon insetting has to be done as a legal agreement. There has to be a contract so that you address these things within the legal agreement to make sure that you're de-risking the insetting process. There aren't an awful lot of good examples to show where that's being done really well yet, I'm afraid, and some of these things may be quite confidential at present, but nevertheless it's definitely worth exploring and definitely worth exploring with your legal advisors. Okay, I think that's the questions in the Q&A answered. If we have any more, please do send them in. As I said at the beginning, you'll be sent a recording of the webinar so that you can share it with colleagues and share it with business partners. And you'll also be sent a copy of the answers to the questions that have been addressed live, but also any further that we get that we'll respond to with written responses. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I hope you found it useful, and maybe see you at our next one. Thank you. Bye bye.